Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. If you have not already subscribed to my channel, please do subscribe to my channel. Today's topic is about macro libraries, and this is part 8 of our SAS Macro series. First, let us try to understand what SAS Macro library is and what kind of SAS Macro libraries are available for us. Before going into those details, first let's try to understand why we need a macro library. Till now, the major focus was how to write a macro and other nuances related to this macro code. But it is very important to know how to store this code or our macro. The reason being, whenever we are writing macro, the intention is that one person creates or one programmer creates the macro, and many people or many programmers will use this macro code. To use this macro code in such a way, we need to either store the macro or macro code in one location and all others can use from that particular location. There are two main advantages of this approach. The first one is ease of use. One programmer builds the program and everybody can use that program or macro. Another advantage is it avoids copying the macro code into each programmer's program separately. Whenever macro program is copied into separate programs, what could happen is the programmer could change the code according to his or her wish, and then what finally will happen is we will have a different copies of same macro, but the macro itself might have been modified a whole lot, and this kind of thing is not good in any organization. There are three ways to create macro library. The first one is %include. %include is nothing more than pointer to our code. And the second one is SAS stored compiled macros, wherein we compile macros and store in a particular location. The next one is autocall library, and this is very similar to %include, but it is little different than %include. We will discuss all those in upcoming slides. Now let us try to understand %include. As I was earlier saying, %include is nothing more than a pointer to code. To understand this, let us look into one of .sas file in here. In here, I have one of my .sas file wherein I am saying it's test1.sas. Let me click on this one. Once we click on this one, we can see that I have a macro in here wherein I am saying macro pp, and then I am also saying procprint data equal to sashelp.cars and then run %mint. I do not have any parameters. I just made a very simple macro in here. And I have saved this code in this particular location sometime back just to illustrate whole of this. Now let me close this and let me also right click on this and see where is the location. The location of this file is in this particular location, and if you see in here, I have also have my %include statement, and I have given the exact path in here. Now by doing this, what I am doing is I can access my macro which is stored in here. Now let us quickly run this %include statement. Once I run this %include statement, my macro will be compiled. And I can execute this macro by giving macro name, and before the macro name all I need to do is I need to put %. And in here I can execute my macro by saying %pp, and once I run it, it will do my proc print of sashelp.cars. If you remember, our macro is nothing more than code related to sashelp.cars. Now let me again close this. Not only this is the one way to do a %include, we can also do %include with the help of file ref. What is meant by file ref? File ref is nothing more than, it is another pointer wherein I am saying file name and we give file ref followed by path. Whenever I want to use this path, instead of writing my path, I can just give this file ref. So whenever I say this file ref, it means this particular location. Now I can do a percent include and I can use this file ref. When I'm using the file ref my file, this means I'm using or I'm accessing this particular path. So our include becomes, or our percent include becomes percent include and this whole of this path. In here I have a different file, that is test2.sas. Let's look into test2.sas real quick. In test2.sas I have a macro which is known as PM, and I have a parameter dsn equal to, and in here I have proc means data equal to ampersand dsn run, and then I'm closing my macro with %ment. Whenever I say test2.sas means I'm just telling about the relative path, but what I mean is whole of this path which I can get by clicking on the properties. That is what I mean by test2.sas means the whole of this path. Now once I have run this particular code, what it does, it compiles my macro, and now I can access my macro by simply doing my macro name followed by passing the parameter. Here I want to pass sashelp.class, and here you can see that it does the proc means. And here what I wanted to tell is, now I want to tell one important thing in here. Percent include is just not for macros. We can also use our regular code also. So percent include is not very specific to macros, but we can use it also for macros. Now in here I have another folder wherein I have said my new folder 1, and in here I have ds.sas program in here, and in here I have a simple data step. This simple data step also I can execute through percent include. Now if I run this percent include, what it does is it immediately executes the code which is there in this ds.sas. That is our simple data step where we are doing a set statement and copying the data to another data set class. There are a couple of other specialty related to percent include. Now in here if I look into test1.sas, I have only one macro. I need not have one macro. I can have 10 macros in this particular .sas file. This is something special about percent include. And when we do a percent include for this test1.sas, if I have multiple macros in it, what will happen is all the macros will be compiled. And not only I can have many macros in this particular .sas file, but I can also include some other code also in here. Like I can have my proc print, or I can have my data step, something which is not even related to macro also I can keep it in a file, especially in this particular file. So what you need to understand is percent include is just not meant for macros only, but you can use it for other purposes also. That is, you can keep your other code also in here. Whenever you have macro, when we use percent include, the code will be compiled, and if you have a general code, what will happen is it will be executed immediately, as I have shown you earlier in the case of this data step. Now we have looked into a lot more detail for percent include. Now let us look into the next topic, that is SAS stored compiled macros. Now let us quickly try to understand what happens during macro compilation. I'm not going to provide any details regarding macro compilation because I have made a very extensive video on the same topic, and link for the same I will give in the description below. But once our macro compilation is successful, a macro will be stored in macro catalog. And by default, this catalog is in work library. And in here, this catalog name is known as SAS MAC1. As I'm using SAS Studio, it is SAS MAC1. For others, it could be SAS MACR. For others, it could have a different catalog name. Now, if I run a proc catalog and say proc catalog equal to work.sasmac1 semicolon content semicolon run semicolon and quit semicolon, I can find what all macros which are compiled are available to me. In here, you can see that I have close to 6 macros in here. I have just taken the partial print of this one and kept it in here. The first four are by default created by SAS Studio and is not related to this topic, but the other two macros, PM and PP, are the macros which we have just created and they have been stored in this particular location. The problem with work.sasmac1 is these macros are there only for a particular session. Once we restart our session or once we end our SAS session, these macros will not be there. So they have to be compiled again. To avoid this recompilation over and over again, whenever we need a macro, what we can simply do is we can store this compiled macro, and this concept is known as stored compiled macro facility, or we can simply say stored compiled macro. To store a compiled macro, we need three things. The first thing is we need to do a libname statement wherein we have to give libname, libref, and we need to give the path. Why we are doing this is we want to store our macro to this particular location. So we have to state the libname. And we also need to give an options wherein we need to say options mstored SAS mstore equal to this libref which we have defined in here. So what we're trying to tell here is whatever the macro we are going to store, please store it in here. And we are telling that that store is this libref which is pointed to this location. And whenever we run the macro, we need to say after the macro name /store. And when we do all of these things, what happens is this macro will be compiled and it is stored in this particular location. Now let us quickly run libname, these options, and also this first macro. Everything in the log seems clean and also our libname has worked fine. Now let us quickly go ahead and run the proc catalog in here wherein I am saying proc catalog equal to myslib.sasmacr. So I'm interested to look into the catalog which is there in myslib. Myslib is nothing more than this particular location where we have stored our macro. Now let's quickly run this and see the result. And once I run this, I see the result that this particular macro is there in this particular location. Whenever I say or whenever anybody says libname, he is directly telling that it is pointed to a particular location. In our case, that location is this one. So we have stored our macro. Now you have seen that how we can compile a macro and store in one particular location. Now let us say I don't have this code anymore, but I only have the stored compiled macro. How can I retrieve the code? This can be easily done, but before doing that I want to show you something interesting. I have another macro. Again, it is the same like this first macro, but all I am doing is I am adding one more option after store, that is source. And once I compile this macro, this macro is stored because I have this option source. I can retrieve the code also. Code retrieval is pretty simple and it can be done in many ways, and whatever the way suits you, you can do in that particular way. And in here, what I want to show here is, once let's quickly run proc catalog to see our macro 2 also. Here we have our macro 2 also. Let us quickly remove all the code in here, and we do not have any code in here now. And here what I wanted to show you is, see, I have compiled my macro, but I do not have the code related to it, or I forgot to save it. Now, how can I retrieve the code? As I have already used the word source, I can do a percent copy and write my macro name followed by forward slash source. Whenever I do this, it will write the code to the log. Now let me quickly run this. Now the macro 2 is written to log. Now here we simply wanted to do a copy of this macro 2 to the log. Not only that, what I can do is I can also copy this particular code to a particular location also. To copy the code of macro to a particular .sas file is also straightforward. All we need to do is we need to write percent copy followed by macro name backward slash source, and then we need to mention lib equal whatever the library from which we are copying. Here it is my slib, which we have defined earlier, in which our macro resides, rather I would say our compiled macro resides, and then out equal to the location we want to write that particular .sas file. In here I want to write to this particular location, and my file name is jkl.sas. Now let us quickly run this piece of code and then see what happens. And once I run this code, you can see that there is a new .sas file in here, and in here it has the code related to macro 2. Now we have discussed in detail about stored compiled macros. Now let us quickly try to understand the significance of stored compiled macros. As I said to you, we can compile once and we can use it at later point. To explain this point, let us refresh our session by clicking reload or refresh in here, and then now we are getting into a new session. Once we get into our new session, I need not compile this macro again, and what I just need to do is I need to define my libname, and then I need to also tell the options mstored SAS mstore equal to libref, which we have defined above. Now let us quickly run this libname and options mstored SAS mstore equal to. Now I can easily execute my macros in here. Now I am executing my one macro and gives the result. The important thing to know about in here is, when compared to percent include, whenever we run percent include, the compilation happens again, and whenever you start another session and you do another percent include, the compilation happens again. But in the case of stored compiled macros, this does not happen. Once you store the compiled macros, all you need to do is you need to give libname statement and options like this, and then you can execute the macro. One of the major challenges of stored compiled macros is we also store our code at one location, and we also store our compiled macro at another location. Often this causes confusion. Compilation of macro usually takes very less time. Usually it will be within seconds. So there is rarely any need of creating stored compiled macro. And from the discussions what I see in SAS communities, It is being said that stored compiled macros are hard to maintain also, especially when stored compiled macros have to be migrated. And the discussion regarding stored compiled macros in SAS communities, I will give the link in the description below. One last point about stored compiled macros, and this is from my experience. I have never seen a stored compiled macro in the real environment. And now let's get back to another important topic, that is autocall library. As explained to you before, autocall library is similar to percent include, but we need to understand one important thing here. Percent include is just not for macros. We can write any SAS code and we can store and we can call with the help of percent include. But in the case of autocall library, this is exclusively about SAS macros. Now there are many other differences, but this is the first difference which I want you to remember. Before telling about the differences with the percent include, let's first discuss about autocall library itself. Autocall library is usually a folder or a directory which contains one or more .sas files, and this .sas file contain one macro in each file. Here I have my autolib, and this folder I am going to treat as my autocall library, and in here I have two .sas files. The first one is known as test1.sas and second file is known as test2.sas, and each of these file has one macro in it. Now let me quickly click on each one of them. In here in test1.sas I have a macro. Again, this macro name and this file name should be same. Here it is test1.sas and my macro name is also test1, and I have only one macro. So very specific, unlike our percent include. And now let me close this and let me open test2.sas. Here in test2.sas I have another macro, but only one macro, and this macro name is test2, that is it has the same name of our .sas file. And now let us see what else I need to do to make this work. First we need to use a file name statement wherein I need to say file name followed by file ref and the location of that file, and here this is the location of our file, and in here you can see that I have the same location pasted in here. Now after that I also need to say options m auto source SAS autos equal to, and I need to mention this libref in here. Once I run these two lines of code, I can access all the macros which are there in this particular folder. Now let us quickly execute this test2 macro, and once I execute this test2 macro you can see the result also. To conclude, by simply using file name and using the options m auto source as autos equal to file ref which we have mentioned above, we can access many macros. This is a very clean way of accessing many macros and giving access to many other users all these macros which we have kept in this autocall library. And in here I want you to look into one another important point, that is after SAS autos equal to I have mentioned a parenthesis and then I have given a libref and then I have closed parenthesis. I have done this to show one another thing, that is if you have another file name I can use that another file name also in here. Along with this, something like putting a comma and another file ref, I can put it in here. I do not want to go into details of that topic, but I just wanted to tell you that that particular option is there. Now that we have looked into all three of macro libraries, now let us discuss the final topic, that is order of macro search. What do I mean by order of macro search? When I'm trying to execute a particular macro, what it will see is, it will try to see where is the compiled macro available, or in which location that compiled macro is there. First it looks into work.sas mac1 location. Then it goes and looks into stored compiled macro. Then finally it looks into autocall macro libraries location. And with this, we have completed whole of this topic. But I would like to tell one another thing. To prepare a whole of this presentation, I have taken the help from one of Art Carpenter's paper, and link for the same I will give in the description below. That's all for this topic. If you have liked this topic, please give it a thumbs up, share and subscribe. Thank you.